I discovered my prized 1976 Gibson Les Paul Standard lying in pieces on my apartment floor, neck snapped clean off, body cracked down the middle. My 12-year-old nephew Dylan stood over the wreckage controller still in hand from the video game rage that sparked this destruction. The guitar I spent 3 years saving for working double shifts at the auto shop, practicing on for countless nights, dreaming of recording my album with it. Dylan was laughing, actually laughing. My hands shook as I knelt beside $10,000 of shattered dreams and wood splinters. My name is Todd, and the Gibson wasn't just an instrument. It was my escape, my future, my everything. I found it 2 years ago during a family vacation to Nashville, tucked away in a cramped vintage music store on Music Row called Walter's Guitar Haven. The moment I walked into that dusty shop, the Gibson seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights calling to me from its stand against the back wall. Walter Hutchinson, the 70-year-old shop owner, had weathered hands and stories that could fill libraries. He told me that exact guitar had been used in recording sessions with country legends back in the 1980s. Willie Nelson's backup guitarist had played it on 3 different albums. The wood had aged to perfection, giving it a tone that modern guitars couldn't replicate. "Son, this guitar has soul," Walter said, running his fingers along the mahogany neck. "But she's not cheap. This here's a $10,000 instrument." $10,000. More money than I'd ever held in my hands. I was working at Morrison's Auto Repair back then, making decent money but nothing spectacular. The guitar represented nearly 4 months of my entire salary, every penny I could scrape together. But I had to have it. Something about that Gibson spoke to my heart in ways I couldn't explain. I'd been playing music since high school, writing songs, dreaming of maybe making it to Nashville myself someday. This guitar felt like the bridge between my small-town dreams and something bigger. I convinced Walter to hold it for me. Traded in my car down payment, picked up extra shifts at the shop, worked weekends doing oil changes and brake repairs. For 8 months, I lived on ramen noodles and determination. Every spare dollar went into my Gibson fund. When I finally brought her home to my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, I spent hours just holding her, feeling the weight of craftsmanship and history. The tone was everything Walter promised. Rich, warm, with sustain that seemed to last forever. I wrote my best songs on that guitar, recorded demos in my bedroom, started building a portfolio of original music. That Gibson became my therapy after brutal days at Morrison's. When my back ached from hunching over engine blocks, when customers yelled about repair costs, when life felt stuck in neutral, I'd come home and lose myself in those 6 strings. The guitar never judged, never demanded anything except respect and care. Now Dylan stood in my living room controller, dangling from his hand pieces of my dreams scattered around his sneakers. He wasn't crying or apologizing. He was smirking. "Uncle Todd, it was an accident," he said, but his tone carried zero remorse. "I got mad at this stupid game and threw the controller. It just happened to hit your guitar thingy." Guitar thingy. He called my prized possession a guitar thingy. I knelt beside the wreckage, trying to assess the damage. The neck had snapped completely where it joined the body. The beautiful sunburst finish was cracked in spiderweb patterns across the face. Pieces of the bridge had broken off, and I could see the internal bracing was damaged too. This wasn't something that could be repaired. This was total destruction. "Dylan, this guitar cost me $10,000. I said, my voice barely steady. "I saved for almost a year to buy it." He shrugged. Actually shrugged. "It's just a guitar, Uncle Todd. Mom says you can get another one." Just a guitar. The dismissal in his voice sent ice through my veins. This kid had no concept of value, of sacrifice, of what this instrument meant to me. But what chilled me more was realizing this might not have been as accidental as he claimed. "Dylan, tell me exactly what happened," I said, standing up slowly. His story changed immediately. First, he said he threw the controller at the wall. Then, he said it slipped from his hands. Finally, he admitted he was angry because his game character died, so he kind of threw the controller toward my guitar stand. But I didn't mean to break it, he added quickly. Besides, you're an adult. You're supposed to understand that kids make mistakes. The way he said supposed to understand sounded rehearsed, like someone had coached him on how to manipulate adults using guilt and expectations. The smirk returned to his face as he watched me process the destruction of something I treasured. That's when my sister Sarah burst through my front door keys, jingling, face flushed with concern. Dylan had apparently called her the moment the guitar shattered, putting on quite the performance about being scared and sorry. Todd, honey, Dylan told me there was an accident, she said immediately, wrapping her arms around her son. Are you okay, sweetie? She asked Dylan, not me. I'm fine, Mom, Dylan said suddenly, switching to wounded victim mode. But Uncle Todd seems really mad about his broken guitar. I feel terrible. Sarah turned to me with sympathetic eyes, the kind reserved for people overreacting to minor inconveniences. Todd, I know you're upset, but it was just an accident. These things happen when kids are around. Dylan feels awful about it. I stared at my sister, someone I'd shared a childhood with, someone who knew how much music meant to me, someone who watched me work myself to exhaustion, saving for this guitar. She was treating this like a broken coffee mug. Sarah, this guitar was worth $10,000, I said. It's not replaceable. It was vintage, one of a kind. $10,000? She looked skeptical, like I was exaggerating. Todd, that seems excessive for a hobby. Besides, Dylan didn't mean for this to happen. You know how kids are. Hobby. She called my music a hobby. Dylan nestled closer to his mother, playing the frightened child perfectly. But when Sarah wasn't looking directly at him, I caught glimpses of something else in his expression. Satisfaction. Like this destruction had accomplished exactly what he intended. Mom, Uncle Todd is making me feel really bad, Dylan whimpered. I already said I was sorry. Can we go home now? Sarah hugged him tighter, shooting me a look that suggested I was the problem in this situation. My own sister was protecting the person who destroyed my most valuable possession while treating me like an unreasonable bully for being upset about it. Todd, Dylan's just 12 years old, she said firmly. He made a mistake, he apologized, and that should be enough. Holding on to anger about material possessions isn't healthy. You know, Mom and Dad raised us better than that. There it was, the manipulation. Suddenly, this wasn't about my destroyed guitar or Dylan's lack of accountability. This was about my character, my spiritual development, my worthiness as a family member. As they left my apartment, Dylan looked back at me with that same smirk. No remorse, no understanding of what he'd done. Just satisfaction at getting away with destruction while making me the villain for caring about something I'd worked so hard to obtain. I spent the rest of that evening sitting among the pieces of my Gibson, realizing this was about much more than a broken guitar. This was about respect, accountability, and family members who'd rather enable destructive behavior than address it honestly. Little did I know this was just the beginning. The next morning brought a phone call that shattered what remained of my faith in family loyalty. My mother Linda's voice carried that particular tone she used when someone needed to be corrected for their own good. Todd's sweetheart Sarah told us about the incident yesterday, she began. I think we need to have a family discussion about this situation. Incident, not destruction, not Dylan's behavior problem, not my devastating loss. An incident. Mom, Dylan destroyed my $10,000 guitar and laughed about it, I said. There's nothing to discuss except when he's going to replace it or face consequences for his actions. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Todd, that's exactly the attitude Sarah was worried about, Mom finally said. You're letting material possessions come between you and your nephew. That guitar was just an object. Dylan is family. Just an object. The same dismissive phrase Dylan had used now coming from my own mother. Mom, would you call Dad's classic Mustang just an object? Would you tell him to forget about it if someone destroyed it for fun? That's completely different, Todd. Your father's car is a legitimate investment and restoration project. Your guitar was an expensive toy for a hobby you should have outgrown by now. The words hit like physical blows. My music wasn't legitimate. My passion was childish. My years of practice songwriting and dreams of maybe making it as a session musician were just expensive toys I should have outgrown. Dad's voice came on the line, suggesting they'd been discussing my reaction before calling. "Son, your mother's right," Frank said in his authoritative contractor voice. "Family comes first always. Dylan's going through some tough times at school, and he doesn't need his uncle holding grudges against him for childhood mistakes." Tough times at school. This was the first I'd heard of any problems with Dylan's behavior, despite having family dinners twice a month for the past year. "What kind of tough times?" I asked. Another long pause. "Dylan's been having some anger management issues," Dad admitted. "His teacher says he's been destroying other kids' projects when he gets frustrated. Sarah and Brian are working with a counselor to help him learn better coping mechanisms." The revelation hit me like ice water. My family had known Dylan had a pattern of destroying other people's property when angry, but nobody thought to warn me before leaving him alone in my apartment. They'd set me up to be his next victim, then acted shocked when he followed his established pattern. "You knew he destroys things when he's angry, and you didn't tell me," I asked. "Todd, we didn't think he'd do anything like this at your place," Mom said defensively. "Besides, the whole family agreed that spending time with his uncle might help Dylan learn better values." Learn better values. They'd used me as an unpaid therapy experiment for a kid with destructive tendencies, and when it backfired exactly as any reasonable person could have predicted, they were blaming me for being upset about the predictable results. The family meeting that evening took place at my parents' house, the same dining room where we'd celebrated holidays and birthdays for decades. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was the defendant. Sarah arrived with Brian, her husband, looking like they'd coordinated their strategy in advance. Brian carried himself with the confidence of a successful corporate lawyer, wearing a tailored suit, even for a casual family gathering. His handshake was firm and calculating, the kind designed to establish dominance through subtle intimidation. Dylan sat between his parents, playing the role of traumatized child who'd been victimized by his mean uncle's overreaction. He'd perfected the art of looking small and vulnerable, while his eyes tracked every adult conversation with sharp intelligence. Brian took control of the discussion immediately, using his courtroom skills to reframe the entire situation. "Todd, I understand you're frustrated about your guitar." He began his tone, suggesting reasonable patience with an unreasonable person. "But let's put this in perspective. We're talking about an object versus a child's emotional well-being. Object versus child. The same false dichotomy everyone kept using, as if holding Dylan accountable for his actions would somehow damage his emotional well-being, rather than teach him crucial life lessons. Brian, that guitar was worth $10,000, I said. It took me 8 months to save for it, and it can't be replaced." Brian smiled condescendingly and pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos until he found what he wanted. "Todd, let me show you something," he said, turning his screen toward me. "This is my new Mercedes AMG GT. I bought it last month for $110,000. The car in the photo was stunning. Sleek silver paint, perfect lines, clearly worth more than most people's houses' down payment." Brian swiped through several images showing different angles of his automotive masterpiece. "Now imagine if someone accidentally damaged my car," Brian continued. "Would I let that come between me and my family? Would I hold grudges and demand compensation? Of course not, because I understand what really matters in life." The comparison was insulting on multiple levels. Brian could afford to replace his Mercedes without financial strain. I couldn't afford to replace my guitar without starting my savings over from zero. More importantly, His car was transportation. My guitar was my creative outlet, my stress relief, my connection to something larger than myself. But Brian wasn't finished with his performance. Besides, Todd, accidents happen around children. If you choose to keep expensive items where kids can reach them, you have to accept some responsibility for the consequences. Choose to keep expensive items where kids can reach them. He was blaming me for owning something valuable in my own apartment, as if I should have predicted that my family would use my home as a testing ground for their son's anger management therapy. The worst part came when my own parents nodded along with Brian's reasoning. Dad actually commended Brian for his mature perspective on material possessions versus family relationships. "Brian's absolutely right, Todd," Dad said. "You're 32 years old. It's time to stop playing with toys and focus on what really matters." Playing with toys. My passion for music, my creative outlet, my dreams of maybe making it as a professional musician someday, all dismissed as playing with toys by people who should have supported my aspirations. Mom delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "Todd, sweetie, we raised you to be forgiving and understanding," she said. "Dylan made a mistake, but he's learning from it. What are you learning from this situation?" The question hung in the air like a trap. According to my family's logic, Dylan's destructive behavior was a learning opportunity for him, but my emotional response to having my property destroyed was a character defect I needed to overcome. Sarah jumped in to reinforce the guilt campaign. "Todd, Dylan really looks up to you," she lied smoothly. "This is your chance to teach him about forgiveness and family love. Show him what it means to be a good person." Dylan nodded solemnly, playing his part perfectly. But when the adults weren't looking directly at him, I caught him rolling his eyes and smirking at my discomfort. The meeting ended with my family presenting me with an ultimatum disguised as loving guidance. I could choose to forgive Dylan and move on like a mature adult, or I could continue holding grudges and damage my relationships with everyone I cared about. Brian shook my hand as they prepared to leave, his grip slightly too firm, his smile slightly too confident. "Todd, I'm proud of you for considering what really matters," he said. "Family is everything, and material possessions are just distractions from genuine happiness." As they walked to their cars, I watched Brian click his key fob, and his Mercedes chirped in response. The sound seemed to mock everything he just said about material possessions being distractions. The man who lectured me about perspective and family values drove home in a car worth 11 times what my guitar had cost. I stood in my parents' driveway realizing I was completely alone in this situation. My own family had gaslit me into believing that caring about something I'd worked hard to obtain made me selfish and immature. They'd turned my victimization into a test of my character while protecting Dylan from any consequences for his destructive actions. But as I drove home that night, something began shifting inside me. Instead of feeling defeated, I started feeling curious. If my family believed so strongly in forgiveness for accidents and moving on from material losses, then surely they'd apply those same standards consistently. After all, accidents happen, right? Sarah's phone calls began the very next morning, each conversation a masterclass in psychological manipulation, disguised as sisterly concern. She'd apparently coordinated her campaign with military precision calling at strategic times when I'd be tired or distracted, making her arguments seem more reasonable. "Todd, I've been thinking about our family meeting." She began during her 7 a.m. call, knowing I'd just gotten off a late shift at Morrison's. "I really believe this situation could bring our family closer together if we handle it right." Handle it right, according to Sarah, meant me providing Dylan with an opportunity to practice receiving forgiveness without earning it. She explained that Dylan was struggling with self-esteem issues at school, and my anger about the guitar was making him feel worse about himself. "He needs to see that people can forgive him even when he makes big mistakes," Sarah said. "You could really help his emotional development by showing him unconditional family love." Unconditional family love. She'd weaponized every positive value our parents had taught us, turning forgiveness into something I owed Dylan, regardless of his actions or attitude. The phone calls continued throughout the week. Sarah would reference our childhood, reminding me of times when family members had forgiven each other for various infractions. She'd mention our grandparents' teachings about mercy and understanding. She'd even quote Bible verses about forgiveness despite not having attended church regularly since high school. "Remember when you accidentally broke Mom's antique vase playing baseball in the house?" she asked during one call. "Did Mom hold a grudge? Did she demand you replace something that couldn't be replaced? No, she showed you grace and understanding." The comparison was manipulative and false. I'd been 8 years old, genuinely remorseful, and the vase had been an actual accident during normal childhood play. Dylan was 12, showed no remorse, and had deliberately targeted my guitar during a pattern of destructive behavior that my family had hidden from me. But Sarah pressed her advantage whenever I tried to point out these differences. "Age is just a number, Todd. What matters is teaching children that family love is stronger than material losses. Dylan needs to experience forgiveness so he can learn to forgive others." The psychological pressure intensified when Sarah brought Dylan to my apartment for what she called a healing conversation. I opened my door to find them standing in the hallway, Dylan clutching a handmade card with "Sorry, Uncle Todd" written in crayon across the front. "Dylan has something important to say to you," Sarah announced, nudging her son forward. Dylan's apology was clearly rehearsed, delivered with the same artificial sincerity actors use in commercials. He spoke about feeling bad, learning from mistakes, and promising to be more careful in the future. The words were perfect, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "I'm really sorry about your guitar, Uncle Todd," he recited. "I know it was important to you and I feel terrible that I broke it. I hope you can forgive me because family is more important than things." Family is more important than things. Sarah had coached him to use her exact phrase, turning my nephew into a weapon in her guilt campaign. "That's wonderful, Dylan," Sarah said, beaming with pride. "Now, Uncle Todd, this is your opportunity to show Dylan what forgiveness looks like." The pressure to hug Dylan and declare everything forgiven was enormous. Sarah watched expectantly. Dylan played his part perfectly, and I felt the weight of family expectations crushing down on me. Refusing would make me the villain who couldn't forgive a child's sincere apology. But as I looked into Dylan's eyes during his performance, I caught something that chilled me to the bone. When Sarah glanced away for just a moment, Dylan's expression shifted to show pure satisfaction. He wasn't remorseful about destroying my guitar. He was pleased with his successful manipulation of the adults around him. The moment Sarah looked back, Dylan's wounded child expression returned flawlessly. This 12-year-old had learned to weaponize adult emotions with frightening skill, and he was enjoying the power it gave him over family situations. I managed to avoid the forced reconciliation by suggesting we needed more time to process everything. But Sarah's disappointment was obvious. She'd expected immediate capitulation to her emotional campaign. The breaking point came during a family barbecue at Brian and Sarah's house the following weekend. Their home was a showcase of suburban success, with perfect landscaping, premium appliances, and carefully arranged furniture that screamed expensive good taste. Brian grilled steaks on his professional-grade outdoor kitchen, while discussing his latest legal victories and recent purchases. The Mercedes sat prominently in their circular driveway, positioned where every neighbor could admire its perfection. "Todd, you should see the sound system I had installed," Brian said, gesturing toward the car. "Premium Burmester Audio 19 speakers cost more than most people's entire stereo setups. But you know what? If someone accidentally damaged it tomorrow, I wouldn't let that ruin my relationships with people I care about." His comment felt calculated, another reminder of his superior attitude toward material possessions and family obligations. But what happened next revealed the true depth of his manipulation. I'd gone inside to use the bathroom and found myself passing Brian's home office, where his door stood slightly ajar. His voice carried clearly into the hallway as he spoke on what was obviously a business call. "Listen, Jerry, family guilt tactics work every time in custody cases," Brian was saying. "You make the opposing side feel like they're damaging their kids by fighting for their rights. Frame everything as being about what's best for the children, and reasonable people will fold rather than seem heartless." I froze in the hallway, realizing I was overhearing Brian's professional strategy session. "The key is making them feel guilty for having normal emotional responses," Brian continued. "If someone's angry about being cheated, you don't address the cheating. You make them feel bad for being angry. Works like a charm in family court." He paused, listening to the other person. "Exactly. People with strong family values are the easiest targets because they'll sacrifice their own interests to avoid seeming selfish or vindictive. You just have to frame their legitimate grievances as character flaws they need to overcome." My blood turned to ice as I realized Brian was describing exactly the strategy my family had been using against me. Every conversation, every guilt trip, every appeal to family values and forgiveness had been calculated. Manipulation, designed to make me abandon my legitimate grievances about Dylan's destructive behavior. "The beautiful part is they end up thanking you for helping them become better people," Brian said with a chuckle. "They think they've grown spiritually when really they've just been trained to accept mistreatment." Brian finished his call and emerged from his office to find me standing in the hallway. His expression shifted briefly to surprise, then settled into his usual condescending smile. "Oh, Todd, there you are," he said, patting my shoulder in what felt like a claim of ownership. "I was just handling some business. Legal work never stops, you know." He studied my face carefully, perhaps wondering if I'd overheard anything significant. When I didn't respond immediately, his smile became more predatory. "I'm really proud of how you're handling this situation with Dylan," Brian said. "It takes real maturity to put family harmony ahead of personal grievances. You're learning what truly matters in life." The patronizing tone made my skin crawl. This man had been orchestrating my emotional manipulation while pretending to guide me toward spiritual growth. Every family value he'd referenced, every appeal to forgiveness and understanding, had been weaponized to protect his son from consequences and establish Brian's dominance over family dynamics. As I drove home that night, I realized I'd been subjected to the same psychological warfare Brian used against opposing counsel in family court. He'd identified my strong family values as vulnerabilities to exploit, then systematically used those values against me to achieve his desired outcome. But Brian had made one crucial mistake during his phone conversation. He'd revealed that people with strong family values were his easiest targets because they'd sacrifice their own interests to avoid seeming selfish. What he didn't understand was that some people with strong values also believe in justice, accountability, and consequences for destructive behavior. And sometimes those people are willing to teach valuable lessons about applying standards consistently across all family members. After all, if accidents happen and material possessions don't matter, surely Brian would appreciate learning that lesson personally. Sleep became impossible after overhearing Brian's manipulation strategies. I spent the next several nights lying awake processing the depth of his calculated psychological campaign against me. But instead of wallowing in anger, I decided to learn everything I could about the man who'd been orchestrating my family's betrayal. My friend Marcus Rodriguez worked in cybersecurity for a Columbus tech company specializing in digital forensics and online investigations. We'd known each other since high school, and he understood my passion for music because he shared similar dreams of making it as a sound engineer. "Todd, you look like someone ran over your dog," Marcus said when I showed up at his apartment Tuesday evening. "What's eating at you?" I explained the entire situation, from Dylan's destruction of my guitar to Brian's manipulation tactics to my family's coordinated campaign of emotional warfare. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as I detailed Brian's phone conversation about exploiting family values. Brother, that's some next-level psychological abuse, Marcus said when I finished. Your brother-in-law sounds like a sociopath in an expensive suit. Marcus had dealt with enough family court cases through his work to recognize manipulation tactics when he heard them. He'd seen how unscrupulous lawyers destroyed families by weaponizing love and loyalty against their victims. You want to know something interesting? Marcus asked. Most manipulators have secrets they're desperate to protect. People who work that hard to control narratives usually have narratives they can't afford to let slip. That comment sparked something in my mind. Brian's confident dominance, his expensive lifestyle, his lecture about material possessions not mattering while driving a $110,000 car. None of it quite added up when I thought about lawyer salaries in Columbus, Ohio. Marcus, is there any way to research someone's financial background legally? I asked. Marcus grinned the same expression he wore in high school when he'd figured out how to hack the school's computer system to improve our cafeteria food. Todd, my man, everything's public record if you know where to look. Financial disclosures, property records, court documents, professional licensing boards. It's all out there waiting for someone curious enough to dig. We spent the next 3 hours learning about Brian Patterson's professional life. Marcus walked me through various databases and public record searches showing me how to navigate legal research tools that most civilians never knew existed. What we discovered was fascinating. Brian worked for Hartwell Murphy and Associates, a mid-sized firm specializing in family law and corporate litigation. According to State Bar Association records, he'd been practicing for 8 years with a clean disciplinary record and partnership track position. But the financial picture didn't match his lifestyle. Look at this, Todd, Marcus said, pointing at property tax records on his laptop screen. Brian and Sarah bought their house 2 years ago for $450,000. Nice place, but check out the mortgage details. The documents showed Brian had put down 20% financing, the rest through a traditional mortgage. Standard practice for most homebuyers, suggesting normal financial status rather than exceptional wealth. Now look at this vehicle registration. Marcus continued pulling up Ohio BMV records. Brian registered his Mercedes AMG GT 6 months ago. Purchase price listed as $112,000, paid in full, no financing. The timeline created an impossible financial puzzle. How does someone with a standard mortgage and typical lawyer's salary suddenly produce $112,000 in cash for a car? Marcus's cybersecurity expertise helped us dig deeper into public financial records. We discovered Brian's law firm had been facing increased scrutiny from the State Bar Association over client fund management practices. 3 different partners had received sanctions for improper handling of settlement money within the past year. Todd, this is getting interesting, Marcus said, scrolling through professional disciplinary records. Look at these patterns. Multiple partners at Brian's firm have been caught mismanaging client funds, but Brian's record stays clean. Either he's the most honest lawyer in a corrupt firm, or he's the smartest one. We spent another evening researching Brian's recent professional activities. Marcus used his legitimate access to various databases through his cybersecurity work, carefully staying within legal boundaries while gathering publicly available information. The picture that emerged was troubling. Brian had been handling several high-value estate settlements over the past year, cases involving substantial cash transfers that required careful oversight and client fund management. The timing of these cases coincided perfectly with his Mercedes purchase and several other expensive acquisitions. Marcus, how would someone hide income from law firm audits? I asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. Hypothetically, they'd need to skim cash from settlements before depositing client funds into proper accounts. Create fake expenses bill for hours never worked, maybe use shell companies to move money around. But that's incredibly risky because law firms audit partner activities regularly. The next piece of our puzzle came from Marcus's girlfriend, Rachel, who worked as a paralegal at a different Columbus law firm. When Marcus casually mentioned our research project, Rachel provided crucial context about local legal industry practices. Brian Patterson from Hartwell Murphy? Rachel said during dinner at Marcus's apartment. Girl, that firm's been drama central lately. Word around the legal community is they're planning a surprise audit of all partner accounts next month. Something about client fund discrepancies. A surprise audit. If Brian had been skimming settlement money or manipulating client accounts, he'd have no advance warning to cover his tracks. The audit would catch any irregularities immediately. Rachel, when's this audit supposed to happen? I asked. First week of next month, she said. Partners don't know it's coming. The State Bar Association's been investigating complaints about missing settlement funds, so they're bringing in outside auditors to examine everything. That timeline gave Brian roughly 3 weeks before his financial house of cards potentially collapsed. If he'd been hiding income or manipulating client funds, the audit would expose everything. Marcus and I spent our final research evening exploring Brian's recent financial activities through legitimate public records. We discovered he'd been converting liquid assets into tangible property over the past 6 months. The Mercedes expensive home renovations, premium furniture and jewelry for Sarah. Todd, this looks like someone preparing for legal troubles, Marcus observed. If Brian knows an investigation is coming, he'd want to convert cash into physical assets that are harder for authorities to seize quickly. The final piece of our research came from pure luck. Marcus's cousin worked as a records clerk for the Franklin County court system, processing various legal documents, including attorney disciplinary actions and ethics complaints. Marcus, tell your friend to be careful, his cousin warned during a phone call I overheard. There's been federal investigators asking questions about some Columbus law firms. Something about client fund manipulation and tax evasion. Can't give details, but people should watch themselves. Federal investigators. This wasn't just a local bar association matter. Brian's potential financial crimes had attracted attention from federal authorities, who investigated tax evasion and money laundering. As our research week concluded, I realized Brian's entire world was more fragile than his confident demeanor suggested. His expensive lifestyle was built on financial crimes that were about to be exposed by audits he didn't know were coming. The man who'd lectured me about material possessions not mattering had built his life around stolen money and hidden assets. The manipulator who taught my family to use guilt tactics against me was desperately vulnerable to the same accountability standards he helped others avoid. Brian had taught me that accidents happen and people should move on from material losses without seeking revenge or compensation. Soon I'd have an opportunity to help him practice those valuable lessons personally. After all, what's good for the family should be good for everyone in the family, right? Planning required patience, precision, and absolute commitment to the same standards my family had imposed on me. If Dylan's destruction was just an accident that I should forgive and forget, then Brian should appreciate learning about forgiveness through personal experience with accidental loss. I spent 2 weeks studying Brian's routine with the dedication of a graduate student researching a thesis. He parked his Mercedes in the same premium spot at Hartwell Murphy & Associates every weekday, always arriving between 8:15 and 8:30 a.m., always leaving between 6 and 7 p.m. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a downtown Columbus office building with an attached parking garage. Brian paid extra for a reserved space on the second-level position near the elevators for maximum convenience. He'd invested in additional security features too. Premium alarm system, GPS tracking, custom paint protection. Marcus helped me understand the garage's security layout through publicly available architectural plans filed with the city planning department. Every commercial building in Columbus was required to submit detailed construction and security specifications as part of their occupancy permits. Todd, look at these blind spots, Marcus said, pointing to areas where support pillars blocked camera coverage. Whoever designed this garage security system did good work, but they couldn't eliminate every visual obstruction. The garage's biggest vulnerability came from ongoing renovation work on the 3rd floor. Construction crews had been upgrading electrical systems for 6 months, requiring various chemical treatments and industrial cleaning supplies stored throughout the building. Morrison's Auto Repair had legitimate contracts with several construction companies for fleet vehicle maintenance, giving me reasonable access to industrial-grade solvents and paint removal chemicals. Nothing suspicious about an auto mechanic purchasing supplies for legitimate work purposes. I selected my materials carefully: methylene chloride paint stripper, industrial-strength adhesive remover, and concentrated acid-based concrete cleaner, all chemicals regularly used in automotive restoration and construction work. Individually, they were harmless maintenance supplies. Combined in the right proportions, they became what insurance companies classify as accidental chemical contamination. The beauty of my plan lay in its perfect mirror logic. Brian's Mercedes would suffer damage that looked exactly like what happens when construction workers carelessly store dangerous chemicals near expensive vehicles. The insurance investigation would find evidence of contractor negligence, not deliberate sabotage. More importantly, Brian would learn about handling accidental material losses with the same grace and maturity he'd demanded from me. He'd discover whether his philosophy about forgiveness and moving on applied when he was the victim instead of the counselor. I chose the evening of Hartwell Murphy's annual holiday party for implementation. Brian would be trapped inside the building for at least 3 hours, schmoozing with clients and celebrating another successful year of legal manipulation. The perfect opportunity for an unfortunate accident involving construction chemicals and premium automobiles. December 22nd arrived with typical Ohio winter weather: cold, cloudy, and miserable. Perfect conditions for accidental chemical spills that might not be discovered immediately in an underground parking garage. I entered the garage through the public access stairwell carrying a maintenance worker's toolkit and wearing coveralls from Morrison's Auto Repair. Nothing unusual about automotive service personnel responding to building maintenance calls, especially during construction season. Brian's Mercedes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its silver paint perfect and unmarked. The car represented everything Brian valued: status, wealth, power, and material success disguised as sophisticated taste. I arranged my chemicals in patterns that suggested contractor carelessness rather than deliberate targeting. A spilled container near the Mercedes front bumper where concrete cleaning acid could splash onto the paint. Adhesive remover dripping from a poorly closed bottle positioned where wind from the garage's ventilation system would carry vapor onto the car's surface. Paint stripper accidentally knocked over near the rear panels. The chemical reactions would take several hours to cause maximum damage, giving me plenty of time to disappear before discovery. By morning, Brian's pristine Mercedes would look like it had been attacked by industrial-strength paint remover and concrete acid. But the most elegant part of my plan involved Brian's insurance situation. Through Marcus's research, we'd discovered Brian had opted for minimum coverage on his Mercedes, believing the law firm's parking garage provided adequate protection. He'd saved money on comprehensive coverage by assuming his expensive car would never be exposed to risks like vandalism or chemical damage. His cost-cutting decision meant no insurance coverage for chemical contamination unless he could prove deliberate sabotage. Since the damage would obviously result from construction worker negligence, Brian would face a total loss with no compensation. Exactly the same situation he'd insisted I should accept gracefully. As I finished positioning the chemicals, I thought about Brian's phone conversation describing how people with strong family values were easiest to manipulate. He'd used my love for family against me, turning forgiveness into a weapon that protected Dylan from consequences while making me seem selfish for caring about my destroyed guitar. Now Brian would learn about family values from the receiving end. He'd discover whether his philosophy of moving on from material losses applied when he was the person facing devastation and financial impact. I left the garage the same way I'd entered, anonymous and unnoticed among the evening's foot traffic. The building's security cameras would show a maintenance worker responding to routine calls, nothing suspicious or memorable. Driving home through Columbus's quiet streets, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Dylan's destruction of my guitar. Peace. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the calm clarity of justice being applied consistently. Brian had taught my family that accidents happen, material possession shouldn't damage relationships, and forgiveness was more important than accountability. Tomorrow morning, he'd have an opportunity to demonstrate those valuable lessons personally. After all, if a 12-year-old's destruction of my guitar was just an accident, I should forgive. And forget surely an adult like Brian could handle accidental chemical damage to his car, with even greater maturity and understanding. He was about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the same standards he'd imposed on others. And just like he'd told me, this would be a wonderful learning experience about what truly matters in life. The student was about to become the teacher. Brian discovered his ruined Mercedes at 7:45 the next morning, and his reaction could be heard 3 floors up through the parking garage's concrete structure. The chemical damage was even more devastating than I'd anticipated. $40,000 of paint interior and engine component destruction that made the car look like it had been attacked by industrial-grade acid. Sarah called me within an hour, her voice shaking with panic and disbelief. "Todd, something terrible happened to Brian's car," she said. "Someone destroyed it in the parking garage. The paint is completely stripped off, the leather interior is ruined, and there's chemical damage to the engine. He's absolutely devastated." Absolutely devastated. The same emotional state I'd experienced when Dylan destroyed my guitar, except Brian's loss was covered by his own poor decision-making regarding insurance coverage. "That's awful, Sarah," I said, matching her concerned tone. "How did it happen?" "Brian thinks it was those construction workers doing electrical work in the building. They must have spilled chemicals or stored dangerous materials near his car. He's threatening to sue everyone. The construction company, the building management, even his law firm for inadequate parking security. Sue everyone." Brian's first instinct was exactly what he told me not to do when Dylan destroyed my guitar. Instead of forgiveness and moving on, Brian wanted legal warfare and financial compensation for his material loss. "Is Brian okay emotionally?" I asked, genuinely curious whether he'd apply his own philosophy to his situation. "He's furious, Todd. I've never seen him this angry. He keeps saying that car represented years of hard work and sacrifice. He can't understand how people could be so careless with other people's property." Years of hard work and sacrifice. The exact same words I'd used to describe my relationship with my guitar, words Brian had dismissed as evidence of unhealthy attachment to material possessions. "Well, Sarah, I'm sure Brian will handle this maturely," I said. "After all, it was probably just an accident. These things happen around construction sites. Brian's always talking about how material possessions shouldn't come between people and their relationships." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. "Todd, this is completely different," Sarah finally said. "Brian's car is worth over $100,000. It's not just some hobby expense. This could impact our family's financial stability." Some hobby expense. She just described my $10,000 guitar the same way Brian had dismissed it during our family meeting. But now that her family faced material loss, suddenly the value mattered, and the financial impact was serious. The insurance investigation began immediately, and the results were exactly what I'd expected. Brian's minimal coverage provided no protection against chemical contamination unless he could prove deliberate criminal activity. The damage looked precisely like contractor negligence, making it a civil matter between Brian and the construction company. But the construction company had their own investigation, which revealed something Brian hadn't anticipated. The chemicals that damaged his Mercedes weren't part of their standard materials inventory. Industrial paint stripper and concentrated acid weren't needed for electrical work, meaning someone else had introduced those substances into the garage. The insurance investigator recommended a criminal investigation to determine whether this was vandalism or an elaborate insurance fraud attempt. Brian found himself under scrutiny from both civil authorities investigating contractor negligence and criminal investigators examining potential fraud. Marcus called me 3 days after the Mercedes incident with news that changed everything. "Todd, you're not going to believe this," he said. "Remember that audit at Brian's law firm? They moved it up after his car got destroyed. Apparently, having a partner potentially involved in insurance fraud triggered an immediate review of all financial records. The audit Brian didn't know was coming had arrived early, sparked by his own attempts to recover compensation for his destroyed car. In trying to prove damages for insurance purposes, Brian had provided financial documentation that revealed discrepancies in his client fund management. Within a week, the audit discovered exactly what Marcus and I had suspected. Brian had been skimming settlement money billing clients for hours, never worked, and using shell companies to hide income from both his law firm and the IRS. The Mercedes purchase had been financed through embezzled client funds, making it evidence of criminal activity rather than legitimate success. Hartwell Murphy and Associates fired Brian immediately and referred their findings to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. The State Bar Association began disbarment proceedings, and the IRS launched their own investigation into tax evasion charges. Brian's financial house of cards collapsed with breathtaking speed. Bank accounts were frozen, assets were seized for investigation, and his law license was suspended pending criminal charges. The man who'd lectured me about material possessions not mattering lost everything he'd stolen to build his fraudulent lifestyle. Sarah called me again 10 days after the Mercedes destruction, but this conversation was dramatically different. "Todd, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she said. Her voice carried exhaustion and desperation I'd never heard before. "Can you help us financially? Brian's facing federal charges, we're losing the house, and I don't know what we're going to do. Help them financially." The woman who demanded I forgive her son's destruction without compensation was now begging for money to deal with her husband's consequences. "Sarah, that sounds really difficult," I said, using the same sympathetic tone she'd used when dismissing my guitar loss. "But these things happen in families. Sometimes people make mistakes that affect everyone around them." "Todd, this isn't a mistake. Brian's entire career is destroyed. They're saying he could face 15 years in federal prison. We're going to lose everything." Lose everything. The same devastation I'd felt watching pieces of my guitar scattered across my apartment floor, except Sarah's loss resulted from her husband's deliberate criminal choices rather than accidental destruction. "I understand you're upset, Sarah," I continued, "but Brian made his own decisions that led to these consequences. As his family, we need to show him forgiveness and support rather than trying to fix everything with money." The irony of using Sarah's exact words back to her wasn't lost on either of us. She taught me that family members should accept material losses gracefully and focus on emotional support rather than financial compensation. "Todd, you don't understand," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "This isn't about forgiveness. This is about our survival. We need real help, not just emotional support." "Sarah, I think you're letting material concerns come between you and Brian's emotional needs," I replied. "Remember what you told me about Dylan's situation? You said that holding on to anger about material losses wasn't healthy. Brian needs to see that his family loves him even when he makes mistakes." The silence stretched until I could hear Sarah crying on the other end of the line. "Brian was right about one thing, Sarah," I added gently. "Accidents happen around people we care about. Brian accidentally got caught embezzling money and accidentally destroyed his career through poor choices. As his family, we're supposed to forgive these accidents and help him learn from his mistakes." The conversation ended with Sarah hanging up, but her lesson was just beginning. Over the following weeks, she'd discover exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of family members who prioritized forgiveness over financial support. Brian's consequences were about to teach my entire family what accountability actually looked like when applied consistently across all family members. And just like Sarah had promised when Dylan destroyed my guitar, this would be a wonderful learning experience about what really mattered in life. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who end up learning their own lessons. 6 months later, I sat in my parents' living room watching Dylan carefully tune my new guitar, his small fingers moving with surprising precision across the strings. The instrument wasn't another vintage Gibson. I'd chosen a modern Martin acoustic that represented new beginnings rather than attempts to replace what was lost. Brian's federal trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with a guilty verdict on 12 counts of embezzlement, tax evasion, and wire fraud. He'd received 8 years in federal prison, 5 years probation and restitution orders that would keep him financially devastated for decades. Sarah and Dylan had moved back in with my parents after losing their house, their cars, and most of their possessions to asset forfeiture. But the most remarkable change wasn't in their circumstances. It was in Dylan himself. "Uncle Todd, am I holding my fingers right for this chord?" Dylan asked, struggling with a complex fingering pattern. "Try moving your index finger a little higher," I suggested. "Feel how that changes the sound." Dylan nodded seriously, adjusting his grip with the focused concentration of someone who finally understood that creating something beautiful required patience, practice, and respect for the instrument. The transformation had begun 3 months earlier during a conversation that surprised everyone in the family. Dylan had approached me privately during a Sunday dinner, his usual defensive arrogance replaced by something I'd never seen from him before: genuine shame. "Uncle Todd, I need to tell you something about your guitar." He'd set his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't break it by accident. I did it on purpose because I was mad at you." The confession took courage I hadn't expected from him. Dylan explained how he'd grown resentful of the attention my music received during family gatherings, how Brian had encouraged that resentment by calling my songwriting a waste of time and my dreams unrealistic. "What? Dad taught me that successful people don't waste time on hobbies," Dylan continued. "He said you were stupid for caring more about music than making money. He told me that destroying your guitar would teach you a lesson about focusing on important things." Brian had manipulated his own son into becoming a weapon against my passion, using Dylan's natural childhood emotions as tools for his psychological campaign. The 12-year-old had been groomed to see destruction as education and manipulation as normal family interaction. But after Dad got arrested, I realized he was wrong about everything," Dylan said. "He wasn't successful, he was a criminal, and you were the only person in the family who had something real that made you happy." That conversation marked the beginning of Dylan's genuine transformation. Watching his father's life collapse under the weight of lies and criminal behavior forced Dylan to confront the values Brian had taught him. He began understanding that creating something beautiful was more valuable than destroying it, that earning respect was harder, but more meaningful than demanding it through intimidation. My parents had undergone their own reckoning during Brian's legal troubles. Dad apologized for dismissing my music as a hobby while supporting Brian's materialistic priorities. Mom admitted she'd been so focused on maintaining family harmony that she'd enabled destructive behavior instead of addressing it. "Todd, we were wrong to take Brian's side over yours," Dad said during one difficult family conversation. "We let him manipulate us because he seemed successful and confident. We should have supported your passion instead of dismissing it. We taught you to value forgiveness and family unity." Mom added, "But we forgot to teach you that real forgiveness requires accountability." Brian never faced consequences for his behavior, so he kept getting worse until it destroyed him. Sarah's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. Losing her comfortable lifestyle and watching her husband face criminal prosecution stripped away the denial and manipulation that had defined her approach to family problems. "Todd, I spent years protecting Dylan from consequences. Because I thought that was good parenting, she said, during a recent heart-to-heart conversation. But I was really teaching him that he could hurt people without facing accountability. I turned my own son into someone who enjoyed causing pain. She'd enrolled Dylan in counseling to address the behavioral problems that had been escalating unchecked for years. More importantly, she'd started requiring him to earn back trust and privileges through changed behavior rather than manipulation and fake apologies. When Dylan destroyed your guitar, I knew it wasn't really an accident, Sarah admitted. But it was easier to make you the problem than deal with his behavior issues. I used your love for family against you because I was too scared to face the truth about my son's problems. The most meaningful change came through Dylan's genuine interest in learning music. He'd asked to take guitar lessons not as punishment or family therapy, but because he wanted to understand what he'd destroyed when he shattered my Gibson. I want to know what it feels like to create something, instead of just breaking things, he'd told me when requesting lessons. Teaching Dylan had become one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. He approached music with the intensity of someone who'd learned that beautiful things required protection and respect. His progress was remarkable, but more importantly, his attitude had transformed from entitled destruction to grateful creation. "Uncle Todd, listen to this," Dylan said, strumming a simple melody he'd been practicing for weeks. The song was basic, just 4 chords in a pattern any beginner could manage. But hearing Dylan create music instead of destroying it felt like witnessing a small miracle. This was the same kid who'd laughed while standing over the pieces of my $10,000 guitar, now carefully crafting sounds that brought joy instead of pain. "That's beautiful, Dylan," I said, and meant it completely. Brian's downfall had taught our family crucial lessons about accountability consequences and the difference between enabling destructive behavior and providing genuine support. We'd learned that real forgiveness required acknowledgement of harm, done not just demanding that victims move on without justice. Most importantly, we'd discovered that protecting family members from consequences actually damaged them by preventing the growth that comes from facing the results of poor choices. Dylan was becoming a young man who understood that respect was earned through consistent good choices, rather than demanded through emotional manipulation. Sarah was learning to parent through clear expectations and accountability rather than protection from consequences. My parents had rediscovered the difference between supporting family members and enabling their worst behaviors. As for me, I'd learned that sometimes teaching people about their own standards required applying those standards consistently. Brian's philosophy about material losses and family forgiveness had been perfectly valid when applied to Brian himself. "Uncle Todd, when I get good enough at guitar, can we write a song together?" Dylan asked. "I'd love that, Dylan. What would you want the song to be about?" He thought for a moment, his young face serious with consideration. "Maybe about how people can change when they stop making excuses and start making better choices," he said. I smiled, realizing Dylan had learned the most important lesson of all. Growth required facing truth, accepting accountability, and choosing to create rather than destroy. 6 months earlier, I'd lost a guitar worth $10,000. Today, I'd gained a nephew worth far more than any instrument. Dylan was learning to channel his intensity into creation rather than destruction, and our entire family was healing through honesty rather than manipulation. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are also the most valuable ones, and sometimes the person who thinks they're teaching ends up learning the most important truths of all. As Dylan continued practicing his chords, I thought about Brian serving his sentence in federal prison. He'd probably learned by now that his manipulation tactics didn't work on prison guards and fellow inmates. Perhaps he was discovering what genuine accountability felt like after years of avoiding consequences through psychological warfare. I hoped he was learning the same lesson Dylan had discovered, that creating something meaningful was far more satisfying than destroying what others had built. And maybe someday Brian would understand that the most successful people weren't those who manipulated others, but those who built something real through honest effort and respect. The sound of Dylan's careful practice filled the room, each note a small victory over the destructive patterns that had nearly ruined our family. We'd all learned that real strength came not from avoiding consequences, but from facing them with grace and using them as opportunities to grow. And that lesson, I thought, as Dylan mastered another chord progression, was worth far more than any guitar could ever be. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a family member enable someone's destructive behavior while making you feel guilty for being upset about it? How did you handle the situation? And what did you learn about setting boundaries with people who use family loyalty against you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's dealing with similar family manipulation. If this story resonated with you and helped you think about accountability in your own relationships, please give it a like and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for yourself while maintaining your values. And don't forget to share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to expect family members to face consequences for their choices. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that real family love includes respect, honesty, and the courage to hold each other accountable. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their worst behaviors, even when it's difficult in the moment. Take care and remember that you deserve to be treated with respect by everyone in your life, especially the people who claim to love you the most.